Hi, hello, good morning everyone. Welcome to the latest in the Blue Thread series of webinars, where we generally explore the wide world of water and how it affects all of our lives and livelihoods. So for those of you that haven't met before, for those that are new to the podcast, I'm Mark Smith. I'm the Water Sector Director for RSK, and I'm delighted that you've decided to spend the next hour with us learning about unlocking the future of water management in the food and drink industry. So I think this is a really, really interesting topic, and one that we'll probably come back to again in the future because there's so many different angles on it. But essentially, a growing global population and an economic shift towards more intensive consumption means global freshwater use has increased almost sixfold since the start of the 20th century. Water resources obviously vary by region, depends where you are actually. And geography, but with the highest resources in South America, and the lowest obviously in the arid regions in North Africa, Southeast Asia as well. But wherever we are, water really is becoming, more difficult to manage, more expensive to access, and therefore I think more precious. And one of the sectors that of course is utterly critical and needs water more than anything is the ability to grow food, and food security and security of supply is in the agricultural sector. So that's where we're going to spend our next hour or so. So I'm delighted with that. But ultimately, food supply and security of water are completely intermingled. And to allow food and drink manufacturers to invest and develop the sector in the face of the climate change with droughts, more extreme weather conditions, the agricultural industry really needs resilience to drought to guarantee harvests that really aren't affected catastrophically. So you're not going to invest in something if, by a whim of nature, the whole crop can be lost. So what we're looking at is sort of worldwide, we use approximately 70% of fresh water withdrawn from agriculture, And in some regions, this is even higher actually. But interesting, I was reading something the other day actually about in an Irish Times article, and Diageo, the global food, or certainly the global drinks giant, they said that water security poses the highest climate change risk related to its entire business, and it's currently investing millions and millions in water efficiency projects and looking to reduce its water consumption by up to 40% in those parts of the world where water is restricted, and 30% overall. So lots of money, being into water consumption reduction, and that's what we want to talk about today. So we've got a sort of split today, which is really interesting. But before I get into that, maybe we can talk about the housekeeping. So, as you know, the microphones are off, but there's lots of you can ask your questions in the question box. We're on all the usual social media channels, which is where we want to be. And I'm trying to develop this into more conversations. So please, if you can get out there and talk to people, tell people about this webinar, it really helps us to be able to continue putting them on. And if you have topics that you would like us to cover, or you would like to appear on this, please just let me know, email into me, and we'd be able to pick that up and hopefully come back to you. But before I kick off, maybe I'd like to introduce, we've got two panels today, and the way I would like to do this is the first panel is in the UK and the second panel is in Australia. So we're delighted to have our colleagues from Australia, and it's a really interesting project I want to talk about. But before we get to that, let's talk about the UK. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Wynne, Dr. Sarah Wynne, who's the Managing Director from ADAS Climate and Sustainability. And Sarah's been in this area of study for many, many, many years. I shouldn't say too many, how many, Sarah? But essentially, she's a strong focus on supporting the food industry, in particular the agricultural sector. And it's all about sustainability of production practices. The main focus of her work are in reducing the climate and water impact of agricultural production. So that's absolutely perfect. And with Sarah this morning, delighted to also introduce Toby Townsend, who's a principal consultant also in ADAS Climate and Sustainability. and he works with food and drink businesses to measure the sustainability and productivity of the supply chain to develop strategies for improvement. So what I thought we'd do this is we could start off, and maybe Toby, you could maybe perhaps start off with talking a little bit at a high level about why should food and drink businesses be thinking about their water use, and then we'll sort of drill it down a little bit more, and before we go to our colleagues in Australia. So maybe over to you, Toby. So why should food and drink businesses really be thinking about their water use? And maybe we could start with that.
Well, sort of to iterate some of the, repeat some of the points you made earlier. Food and drink sector uses a lot of water, particularly in the supply chain. Agriculture is responsible for about 70% of global freshwater withdrawals. But there are increasing pressures on water resources from climate change, population growth, urbanization, and that's creating a lot of risks for food and drink businesses. Now, these risks can be put into three categories. There's physical risks, so that's there being too much water. So in the UK recently, we've had record rainfall that's flooded a lot of our arable land, and come the end of the season, we might see impacts on yields because of that. In recent years, we've also had too little water. We've had drought periods that's also impacted on yields. And the third part of physical risk is the water quality, so water being too polluted. Alongside physical risks, there's also regulatory risks. So regulations that are in the areas that these businesses are operating. So those regulations might change, which might restrict water usage for these businesses, or it might create a situation where they can't be compliant with those regulations, and that might lead to, for example, fines. And then finally, we have reputational risks. So the reputation of the business, the perception of that by the shareholders or local people or consumers. So they might perceive that the business is not operating in a sustainable or ethical way with regards to the shared water resources. So businesses need to be aware of these risks, and these risks are growing because of climate change, population growth, and urbanization. They need to be able to understand those risks, measure them, and develop mitigation opportunities to address them.
I mentioned actually in my introduction about drought, but you of course also mentioned about too much water, didn't you? So it's a bit like too much water, too little water, and then the water quality. So I mean, I suppose the extreme weather brings both the opportunity to sort of have to manage both in rapid succession. Would that be right? Yeah, flooding followed by drought, or drought followed by flooding, followed by drought. So that obviously offers more detail. That's probably more difficult to deal with than perhaps a prolonged flood, or maybe that's a misconception.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you come to look at the combined impacts of flooding and drought, you've got to be thinking about how do you increase the resilience of your agricultural system or your businesses, and are able to protect against both. Things like improving soil health and soil quality to enable your soils to be resilient to flooding, enable drainage of land to allow the floodwater to get away, but also not drain it so much that when you get to a drought situation, you're not holding enough water in your land. So yeah, some real challenges there to manage the combined impacts of both flood and drought.
Okay, so I think, Sarah, I mean, where are food and drink businesses having the biggest impact on water use? You know, where is that, in the supply chain, or where? What?
Yeah, I mean, Toby mentioned the fact that we've got 70% that is used to produce food is being used in the agricultural part. So the biggest part of the picture is actually what's happening on farm. There's about 20% of the water usage in food production happens within the facilities, so within the processing and production processes, and that's where the food and drink companies have the greatest ability to have direct influence. So they can put measures in place in their facilities to reduce water consumption, to monitor water consumption, to understand how water is being used, look for opportunities for recycling water, and in parts of the situation where it's possible to recycle it. Of course, there are some places where you need to have food grade water, but if there's other places where actually you can recycle water for cleaning purposes in certain parts of the facilities, looking at those sorts of things. So we do have different levels of influence that we can have. And when we look in the agriculture part of the supply chain, it really depends upon how much contact a business has with the supply chain. So are they purchasing a raw material directly from farm, or do they have a long and complex supply chain that they need to work through in order to be able to understand what's happening at farm level?
Okay. And in terms of different water qualities, how common is that, Sarah? That, you know, I mean, basically what comes out the tap or what comes out the water, public water supply is food grade, isn't it? Right. So it's drinking water.
Yeah.
And how common is it to have more local, in the UK particularly, more local recycling that produces perhaps cheaper water, or and which is suitable for irrigation?
Well, now you're heading outside of my challenges. So when we're looking at irrigation, it's about understanding what is coming through the system. So are you using a borehole? Are you extracting from a river? Are you extracting from a reservoir, etc.? And then what is in that water? So is that water high in nitrate? Has it got pesticide residues in it? Has it got any other contaminants in there? So yeah, it does impact the quality of the water that you're using on the irrigation. You can't just put any water on your fields.
Okay, because I think again, just something I was thinking about. I was talking to somebody in North Africa the other day, actually, and they're talking about putting a lot of desalination plants along the coast, and those weren't for drinking water supplies; they're essentially for irrigation of plants in the interior. But anyway, I'm sort of drifting here a little bit. So maybe I could pull it back to Toby and say, you know, Toby, how do we address water usage in the supply chain? How aware is the supply chain of water usage? How do we sort of work with the supply chain to reduce the water usage? How is that done in the agricultural sector?
Well, I guess as Sarah mentioned, it is about a key aspect is how much control does the business have over the supply chain, how much visibility. The first step is to understand how much water is being used, so to quantify it, to create a water footprint. The next step is to understand that in context. So is that water being used in an area where there are pressures on water supplies? Is there a lot of competition for that water? Or is it in an area where there is actually plentiful water supply? So understanding what risks there are for that particular area. But then what a business can do about that depends on that level of visibility and control of the supply chain. So if they have contact with those farmers that are supplying them, then they can have a lot more opportunity to measure water use and understand where there are opportunities to mitigate risk. When it comes to that sort of mitigating risk, there's a number of opportunities that they can follow. So first of all, could be changing where they're sourcing their ingredients from. So they might move from an area where there is pressure on water resources to farms that are actually in areas where there is more plentiful supply of water. But if they need to stay with those particular farmers, they can look at reducing water use within those systems and building resilience. So that could be through in irrigated systems, looking at making those irrigations more efficient. So looking at what equipment's being used and the particular practices that those farmers are using to determine when to apply water and how much water to apply. But there's also the opportunity to improve overall productivity of the system. So if you can manage that agricultural system well so that you are producing more output relative to the amount of water going in, that obviously has a benefit as well. But the key thing here is how much visibility does that business have over the supply chain and how much opportunity there is to have some sort of influence on water use in the agricultural part of it.
And how close do the supply chain, or I guess you call them farmers, work with the ultimate sort of they're the producers, okay? So they how do they work closely with the users of their products, not just in the retail, but also in sort of industrial use? you know, and I think particularly in terms of the water, you know, the water usage, ultimately, if you don't have the water, you can't grow the crops. That's fine, I get that. But in terms of driving down the water within the supply chain, who's taking responsibility for that? And are those conversations happening at all different levels?
Yes, those conversations are happening. I think it very much depends upon the supply chain.
Okay.
If you've got a direct supply chain, and if you're using something that has a high irrigation requirement, so you're using a lot of blue water that's been abstracted from rivers or water sources, then those sorts of supply chains will be the ones who have been taking the earlier action, because those supply chains recognize that they are very heavily reliant upon water. They've got direct visibility of what's happening, and they're able to take action. So we are seeing companies with these shorter supply chains setting targets and then working with their farmers and supporting their farmers in implementing better practices. Where we have the challenge is in the supply chains that are more complex. So if you have a commodity supply chain, so you're buying a ton of grain that has been shipped from somewhere across the world and it's been put into a bulk tanker along with loads of other grain, that's where the challenges arise, because you don't necessarily know precisely which farm that grain has come from and how that grain has been produced. Is it from an irrigated source? Is it from a rain-fed source? And then how has that irrigation been managed? And for those types of supply chains, you need to think a little bit more laterally about what impact can you have within them, because you can't necessarily trace your supply chain back to the beginning. You can't necessarily gain much leverage on the farmers to create change, but can you engage in projects that are in the region that you're purchasing from? So if you're purchasing from a particular region in South America or Africa, are the projects that you can engage in within those regions that can support overall improvements in irrigation management practice, water management, such that although you may not directly influence the grain within your supply chain, you are having an influence on the production of grain from that region.
I mean, I often think about water as, you know, people talk about water as if it's something that's, you know, ultimately we can just move around, but water is heavy, right? So water is local. So you need to be able to work with them. And in terms of the, you know, the businesses with longer, more complex supply chains, you say, you know, are there tools that are used? You know, we talk about water footprinting and stuff like that, and how effective are those tools? Because carbon offsetting has got an awful name recently, and I'm just wondering, you know, is carbon footprinting or some such schemes like that, are they effective at driving down water use?
So you can do water footprinting, and water footprint helps you to understand where your water is being used, how much water is being used, and what type of water is being used. So the water footprinting helps you to understand whether you've got blue water, so abstracted water, versus green water, which is rain-fed, and then also your impact on water quality. So when you are returning the water back into the system, is it going back into the system in a more polluted way than it came to you in the first place, or is it going back cleaner? So then that's your grey water usage. So the water footprinting helps you to understand that. If you've got a remote supply chain and you don't necessarily know precisely what's happening, you can look at some of the more generic water footprinting data to at least understand, if you're purchasing 20 different materials, at least understand which of those materials has the higher water usage and is therefore maybe where you need to focus your efforts on finding out more. So it can be used to help you effectively diagnose where the biggest risks sit, because if you start at the point where you have no idea what the water usage is within the different products that you purchase, then you don't really know where to focus your efforts. So a high level water footprint can help you do that, because it can help you to say, well, actually those are the top 3 products. You purchase lots of them, they use lots of water, and therefore let's focus the time, the money and the effort in understanding more about those supply chains and worry less about the minor ingredients that use less water.
Yeah, and are you finding, Sarah, that water footprinting or this type of approach to sort of people reaching down into their supply chains is getting more common, is getting more sort of important to deciding who to bring into your supply chain? or is it something that is sort of still sort of developing?
I think it is developing in a lot of supply chains. There are some businesses who are further ahead than others. It's always the case. You have early adopters who've recognised risk much sooner. You've got other businesses that are starting to look at water now. So I think it's a mixed picture. I think water is becoming more and more important to businesses, and understanding how those businesses can address their water and manage their water within their supply chain is becoming increasingly important. Okay.
So I guess, Toby, maybe we could sort of start. We need to talk a little bit about what you're calling water stewardship, right? And maybe could you talk a little bit about the importance of water stewardship and how, you know, that a business's approach should ultimately, I suppose, be dependent upon the supply chain and the water, they approach water stewardship as well. I guess it's really important for businesses that their supply chain have an active water stewardship campaign to be able to ensure the sustainability of the product over the long term.
Well, the thing is that these businesses are operating in areas where water resources are shared. So there are other people using those water resources. Water stewardship's about not only understanding the risks to your own business, but also understanding risks to other users of that water. So water stewardship's about minimizing those risks for yourself, but also using that water in a fair way to support other users. Now, when it comes to those complex supply chains where actually you have limited visibility of your own use of water within the supply chain, then water stewardship can sort of help you look at it in the bigger picture. So that could be getting involved in projects where you are working with other users of water in particular areas and looking at creating something holistic to benefit everybody.
I think water stewardship is something that's quite interesting, because we hear a lot in the press about the big sort of water wars of cross-transboundary, international boundary water usage. But I guess more locally, there's quite often there's pressures on water between industrial, agricultural, obviously growing populations, etc., etc. And in terms of water stewardship, who do you think should take control of those water resources? Is that the owner, or is that, because it does encroach on a lot of different social programs as well? Or maybe I'm just thinking, you know, if I need this much water for my farm and somebody else needs this much water for their industry, I guess that's a government body then to decide how to abstract and sort of move that water around. Would that be correct? Or?
Yes, I think somebody needs to take ownership over how to make sure water resource is fairly distributed. I guess the other thing that we need to make sure is that where water is used through a system, so although agriculture will use water, it will also return water to the system, making sure that that water is returned at a quality that can then be used by industry as well. So it's making sure that you've got the regulatory platforms, the compliance there to ensure that the water is being used equitably, but also ethically in terms of ensuring it is returned in a quality that can be used further down the stream, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's such a huge subject, actually. And thank you so much to Sarah and Toby. And can I apologise to Toby? I've sort of removed your doctorate, actually, Toby. So I know you're a doctor. I should have said Dr. Toby. And I think I might have given you one, Sarah. So I won't apologise for that. So. But thanks very much. And I think that's we'll close this session at that point. You come back at the end and we can have a broader conversation. But as we talk, there's just a million questions come into my head, because it's, water touches all aspects of life. And, you sort of say, what about food and the agricultural sector? And then, of course, you're competing for water, aren't you, with all other sectors? So I think there's a lot of ethics come into it as well. Anyway, look, thank you so much. And we'll talk to you again in a minute. Okay.
Thank you.
So we're now going to the second section, and we're going to the other side of the world, and we're going to talk to Michael Bissett, from Pensar Infrastructure, and he's going to talk to us about a really interesting scheme in the Wamuran, I think I'm probably saying that wrong, but Wamuran irrigation scheme in Queensland, just north of Brisbane on the Gold Coast of Australia. So I'm taking it it's a lot warmer where you are, Michael, than it is where I am here in Swindon. When we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I was really interested in, is it Wamuran? Is that right, or is that not right? Is that how you say it?
That's closer, yeah, Wamuran.
Wamuran. Okay, right. I'll say Wamuran. So okay, good. What was really interesting was the role that Pensar have done a really interesting sort of scheme, which is water, reuse of water from the local sewage treatment plant and cleaning that up using the up to sufficient quality, and then piping that to 2 farms, which I think is really interesting in itself. As an engineer, fascinated, but also the fact that you did this with the end users in mind. And I think we've also got Lawrence Stevenson from Twinview Turf Farm on. So hi Lawrence, good evening to you. Thanks for being with us. Twinview Turf Farm grows grass, so I'm going to say it's grass, so it's sod grass rather than turf as I know it. But you don't just grow grass, do you, Lawrence? You grow grass for quality stuff for sports stadium, and you've quite a big acre. I was reading actually it's like 700 acres of turf, and you grow about 2 million square meters a year. Is that right? Is that correct?
That's about right. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're the largest turf producer in Australia.
All right. Okay. Good. So, and also Gavin Skur. So Gavin's with us, and he's another big user in that area from Pinata Farms, and so Gavin's Pinata Farms grow soft fruit. I think strawberries, raspberries, but also pineapples and mangoes. Gavin. So so yep. Welcome. And you've got 800 hectares. Is that right? Under crop.
Yeah, we've got about 1,000 hectares of crops. So a large portion of that is mangoes and pineapples, obviously, but also strawberries and raspberries.
Okay, and I'm guessing down there actually we have there's a need for water security against climate-driven weather events, and I think that's really what this whole scheme is about. So I'll just listen now, Michael. I'll hand it over to you and the guys. Just take us through the scheme, and let's have a chat, and then I'll stay on the screen and just listen. Okay.
Yep. Thanks, Mark. I'll just give everyone a bit of a brief project overview from down under here. The Wamuran Irrigation Scheme, or WIS as we refer to it, is located on the east coast of Australia, approximately an hour north of Brisbane, Mark, instead of down the Gold Coast, in the Wamuran region, or sorry, the Caboolture region. The region is a key growth area when considering the 20 to 30-year expansion of the Greater Brisbane footprint. This forecasted population growth in Caboolture is expected to obviously put pressure on the region's existing water utility infrastructure and the current environmental conditions associated with a river discharge permit. The main purpose of the project was to provide a viable repurposing of treated effluent being discharged into the Caboolture River into a recycled water irrigation scheme for the adjacent Wamuran farming region where Lawrence and Gavin operate. The Wamuran Irrigation Scheme joint venture, or the WIS JV as we know it, was formed early in 2019 in response to this challenge, and consists of Twinview Turf, Lawrence, and Pinata Farms, Gavin, who Mark introduced, and the Pensar Construction Group. Reflecting on this, it's actually been 5 years ago. We had our first meeting at Lawrence's turf farm to discuss the project, which seems a long time ago. But over that time, the team, inclusive of my 2 partners here, have transformed what was an innovative idea at the time of pressurised irrigation water on demand and at the farm gate into an actual irrigation scheme. From a sort of a unique experience from my perspective, more closely linked to the construction projects, was having the 2 main end users involved from the beginning to help not only craft the project, but also to carry some of the load along the journey. So that hopefully gives a bit of an overview of the project. But it's probably time to reflect, I guess, Lawrence and Gavin, looking back at 2019, I guess what were the main project outcomes and reason for involvement, you know, way back then. Maybe if you hit it first, Lawrence.
Sure. Probably Mike touched on it in that being members of this region, we were aware of the local water utilities' desire to have the scheme for about 10 years prior. They did have the foresight to understand that they were going to be discharging too much nutrient into the local ecosystem and they were not going to be allowed to do any more. So for the past 10 years, they had been proposing a scheme, and the scheme that they had proposed wasn't fit for purpose, it wasn't practical, and it wouldn't have been used. I think they saw the farms as having a desperate need for water, whereas we actually all had thriving businesses based on our current water sources. So they came with a plan in 2017 to sort of trickle water onto our farm. But through the three of us, the idea was sprouted and we really forced it forward that it was at pressure on demand. So it was a more attractive water source than our current water sources that we were utilising. So we can turn it on any time of the night or day within the usage schedule and have water come out of our irrigators at 80 psi applied directly to our crops. That reduced the environmental risk dramatically. There was no chance of it being discharged to the environment accidentally because it was going to be applied directly to crops at all times. So that idea was a real founding part of the scheme that allowed us as a joint venture to be awarded the project by the local water utility.
And Gav, for you?
Yes, similar, Mike, in that you know, it's the fit for purpose aspect of it that you know, I guess encouraged us to become involved in you know, what became the design and construct of the scheme, as Lawrence and yourself have outlined. Fit for purpose for us is also, as Lawrence mentioned, you know, on demand and pressurised. You know, so similar to a town water system, so that we turn a tap on and water's there. But also in our instance, growing berries, you know, we're highly sensitive to the quality of that water as well. And we felt that you know, to ensure that we had a fit for purpose scheme, there was benefit in us, you know, becoming involved. You know, we're farmers fundamentally. Myself and Lawrence are both third generation farmers, but to get involved in this project, you know, as farmers, to ensure that it was fit for purpose, not only for us, but also for the other connections, the other farmers that have taken up the opportunity to connect to the scheme during its construction phase, and obviously the future. As Mike mentioned, this area is a high growth area for houses, you know, in the next 20 odd years, and that's meaning that, you know, there'll be more water being treated and hence needing to be used. So, yeah, there's the future capability of it, in our view, that the more fit for purpose it was for us farmers, the more water would be actually used, future-proof the scheme and prevent it becoming a white elephant, which, you know, their initial scheme would have been. They would have spent a lot of money and it would have only been used when we were desperate, in the times of severe drought.
Yeah, I think from my perspective too, having you guys on board, obviously from day one, and having farmer input, quality of water was really important. And then I think your insights, Gavin, from having been involved in a recycled water irrigation scheme, were paramount in the early PCI meetings we had with the client. Was super beneficial. I guess the next point too was the importance of water for farms, Lawrence, from your perspective.
Yeah, so probably if you boil it down, our business is a factory that turns sunlight, nutrient, and water into our product. So we've got plenty of sunlight. We live in sunny Queensland. It's sunny 300 days of the year. We've got plenty of fertilizer available that we can use based on how much sun there is. But for a long time, water was our limiting a limiting factor in terms of production capacity. So having this scheme water as our main source of water now, that's going to allow us to have a higher peak of production throughout our production cycle, which will allow us to have more certainty of production each year. Currently, we sell direct to all of our customers. We've got long-standing relationships with all of our customers. They choose, in the most cases, to buy their turf only through us. So it's a little bit different than a food product, which might go to market, so you can sell whatever you can grow. For us, we have to cultivate the relationships to our customers to sell what we grow. So we can't overpromise, because then we'll not be able to deliver turf to them, and the relationship will crumble. With this scheme water and our increased production, we'll be able to set our sales targets much higher than we can currently, because currently they're set on the more dry years productions. So it's a very important factor for us. This will allow us to grow as a business, but also have much more certainty of employment for our team. For a long time, our only growth was by diversifying into other things, which you alluded to before, being the construction of sports fields and stadium surfaces. So that's provided tremendous growth for us as a business over the last 6 years, whereas now we'll be able to grow agriculturally and produce even more meters of turf each year.
It's an interesting overlap, I guess, what Sarah and Toby mentioned about control of the supply chain when considering water as a resource. So it's a common item, and that's a good segue into one good thing I liked about the project too, that had so many pluses about it, but I think top of that heap was the community benefits. And I know Gavin, with his surety of water, I think are you the biggest employer with your staff? If you want to outline some of the benefits that possibly will be derived in the future.
Yeah, sure, Mike. And just following on from Lawrence's comments around the surety of the water gives us confidence to grow more crop. In the past, we've always had to allow a buffer based on weather forecast and how much water we thought we were going to have. No good getting a crop right through until a couple of weeks prior to harvest, and then it dies because it didn't rain and we ran out of water. So what this does is gives us surety of water, despite how dry it might be. The people still have showers, flush toilets, etc. So this water is very short. The benefits for the community by one, and I guess there's various sizes of community. If we take the farming community in the first instance, our fellow neighbours, particularly those downstream from us, will benefit because we will use this water as a priority over our existing water that comes out of the creek. And that's the main reason is that we actually know the quality of the water that's been supplied through this scheme. It's measured, whereas what comes down the creek, what comes down the creek. So we will use it as a priority. That means the water that we're using out of the creek now continues down the creek. So hence people downstream, farmers downstream from us, have now got more water than they used to have. So they've won out of that. If we broaden the community out a bit further to the local community where we operate, the local towns, Caboolture is the local town, 20,000 people in it. The local villages, we employ about 400 people. They all live in the community, obviously, because that's where they work. So they buy their bread from the baker, they buy their meat from the butcher. By having the surety of water, that'll enable us to grow our business. And when we say this scheme is not operational yet, it's constructed, but the water doesn't come to us until another few months. But that'll enable us to do, and we employ 10 people per hectare or 4 people per acre for you guys over there. So for every 10 acres increases another 40 people that we'll need to employ. They'll all need to live in the local community and hence bolster that economy of the local town. So the towns win. A lot of those people that work for us also come out of the Pacific Islands, so places like Vanuatu, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga. They come in here on specific visas. You know, we sponsor them as an employer. They come and work for us. We're responsible for their pastoral care, etc. So get them to church. We sign them up to local soccer teams, or football, as you guys call it, so that to get to build into their community. But importantly, what happens is instead of our government sending foreign aid to these countries to build infrastructure, we actually import their people. They work for a living and then take that money back home again. And when people earn something, they appreciate it so much more than a handout. So hence that it builds their self-worth. So they go home with their chest out because they've actually done something and have earned real money. They go home after doing the season with us with enough money to buy a modest block of land. That's something that they would never have an opportunity back home for. You know, there's 70-odd% unemployment in these islands. So even if you can get a job, it pays peanuts. Whereas they can go home after one season, buy a modest block of land. They come back next year and do the following season, they've got enough to build the shell of their house. After the third year, they finish the house. The fourth year, they landscape it. And then the fifth, they start doing it for their family. So it makes a massive difference to not only our local economy, but to the economies of these island nations, but also the well-being and also the self-worth of the people that work for us. So yeah, so it touches many points, and and a Southern Hemisphere community at the end of the day.
That's good.
Gavin, can I ask, sorry, just a quick question. Is something that the quality of the water you say is guaranteed, etc., etc. What about the source of the water? The fact it's recycled. Have you had any negative feedback or from your customers or community or anything like that? Has that ever come up in the conversation?
As Mike mentioned earlier, we've got prior experience with recycled water. We've actually been growing berries on recycled water for 15 years in Stanthorpe, the site, 3.5 hours from here. So hence brought a lot of the learnings from that scheme to here. But initially, well, in the first instance, yes, our customers want to know all about it, obviously, for food safety reasons. But we're the level of the water is at Class A. So hence it's nearly potable. It's below 10, and with E. coli, and also the rigorous testing that goes on gives them confidence. And on top of that, the normal water supply is coming down the creek where, without being silly, there's dead kangaroos, there's ducks, swimming in it. There's everything in that. So hence, as a berry farmer, I have a lot more confidence in the water that comes out of the recycled scheme than I do what's in the creek. So its perception, Mark, is probably the summary of that. It's people's perception of what it is. But once you can actually show them the science and the rigor around the process and the testing, there's no issue with confidence.
I think it's just as you say, it's bringing the community with you, isn't it, really? Yeah, and particularly in your case, Gavin, because you produce food that people eat, right? And I think it's getting people over that barrier that it's recycled water. Somehow or other, they don't seem to. We have to sell the fact that everything we do is recycled water. What comes through the public water supply is the same. But it's just, I think, particularly in the UK, there's a sort of aversion to using recycled water from say wastewater treatment or well water treatment. If you treat the water, put it in a river, and take it out 50 meters downstream, that seems to be okay. But if you take it straight from the plant, somehow or other people don't like that. And I think that to me is a story that perhaps that's a journey we haven't walked yet in the UK. We're going to have to, though, I think. So that's really interesting.
And it's exactly the same here. We've got the Murray River, which is the longest river in Australia, and by the time the water gets to the ocean, it's been through 13 kidneys, and yet people have this perception of not drinking recycled water. But you're exactly right. The town at the top of the river pulls it out, treats it, puts it back in the river. It goes 20k downstream, and the next town pulls it out and reuses it. And but no one thinks about that, or it's all about perception and managing those.
Honestly, I think I'll steal that line. It's been through 13 kidneys. Is that 13 pairs of kidneys? Or is that
13 pairs of kidneys, exactly, 26 kidneys. So,
I think
we digress, but you're exactly right, as in when people think about it. But also you need to understand that we're not actually applying it to the fruit. So it's all drip irrigation applied into the soil or into the coconut coir, which is what we grow a lot of our berries in now, in pots or in gutters, similar to what you see over your way. But yes, we're not spraying the fruit with it. There's processes around it, but we're certainly growing the fruit with it.
And I guess, Lawrence, just your business is almost completely the opposite, because it's not soft fruit, it's grass, isn't it, ultimately? And I guess you can do you use water at night, whereas Gavin uses during the day, or how does that work?
Yeah, so probably can speak to both at the same time in terms of quality and nighttime use, because as you said, our product is very, very different. And we are able to water at night or during the day. Currently, we water during both, whereas Gavin needs to water every 8 minutes during the day, otherwise the plant dies. What this allowed us to do was design a scheme that had used much less infrastructure, much smaller pipe and much smaller pumps, because with our diurnal use schedule, we were able to use water at opposing times. So the peak demand was basically halved compared to if we were using water at the same times. It also provided a bit more benefit to the scheme, in that Gavin's crops, being soft fruit, are much more sensitive to water quality, whereas turf is a little bit less sensitive to water quality. One of the key drivers for the local water utility was that they'd be able to use water all the time, which meant that if there were slight peaks in water quality which were outside of the scope of berries, we were able to take it as an end user to continue the scheme operating while they rectified the defects in the water. Our product's much more tolerant to salts than berries. So if they have an inflow issue at the sewage treatment plant, we were still able to use the water. And using it at night meant the pipe was half the size, so they were able to spend half the money, getting a much more efficient outcome.
And I guess also, the fact, guys, that you're not confident of that water supply in the drought years, that obviously enables you to invest for the longer term, and grow your businesses, grow your businesses. Because I think, Lawrence, you said it was, water was the main restrictor of your expansion plans. Would that be right?
It is, yes. Well, as a customer, we've already invested $500,000 Aussie dollars in on-farm infrastructure to be able to use water for the scheme. We've invested a similarly large amount in being able to increase the efficiency of our land. Before, we had corners of paddocks which we didn't need to use, we're able to use now. So we've been able to invest a lot of time and energy and money into that part of it. But also, we're able to invest in sales and marketing again. We've been very fortunate in our business to have been capped out by our production, by our natural demand. So now we're looking to increase our baseline production. We're really excited to be able to get back on sales and marketing and bring more customers through our business, and sort of grow our business that way.
It's fascinating. Maybe we could ask Sarah and Toby to join us just for the last 10 minutes, I think, because we've got a couple of questions. I think there's a couple of themes that run through this. So I don't know if Sarah and Toby can rejoin us. Yes, okay, excellent. So I guess, guys, Sarah, I mean, you've just heard something that's really interesting from the actual farmers, from the suppliers, about the importance of water to their world. I mean, do you have any examples of successful partnerships between industry players and sort of utilities or suppliers within the UK? And maybe you could share some insights on those.
Not our area of work, Mark.
Okay. No, that's fine. I think what's really interesting is the way we have divided and split up the water sector, so that we don't think of different uses for the water. I think the fact that, you know, there's the investment that's gone into this scheme in Australia, although these guys invest in their businesses. I suppose, Gavin and Lawrence, do you use any schemes like say water footprinting, or how important is your use of water to your clients? Do they, or are they just looking for you to develop to you know, build to grow the best crop for their customers? How does that work? Do you use any sort of schemes like that?
Not official schemes as such. It's part of our sustainability framework that is driven, you know, largely by our customers. So the large retailers are pushing, you know, their sustainability goals back onto their suppliers, and that's us. So it's about, you know, minimising water in this instance, and hence why we're moving into substrate production, which is growing a bit out of the soil, either pots or gutters, depending on the, you know, raspberries or strawberries. Reducing water usage by about 30%, just doing that. It also reduces nutrient by a similar amount, and that's because we're containing it within a pot rather than it flowing, you know, into the soil and leaching out when it rains. We monitor that literally 24/7, so we've got sensors in the field that actually telling us the moisture use of the plant. So we're actually applying the water and nutrient, so nutrient in the water, whenever the plant needs it. So that's similar to an intravenous drip on a human. That's what we're doing with plants. So these sensors actually telling us when the plant wakes up in the morning, when it actually starts drawing moisture. We then start watering. We increase the watering as the day warms up. As you know, mentioned before, you know, that can come down to sort of 8 or 10 minutes apart watering. And then as it slows down in the afternoon, as the sun goes down, we back the waterings back off based on what these sensors are telling us what the plant's using. So we're giving the plant exactly what it needs when it needs it. And hence why we've got to water during the daytime, because that's when our plants are using it. And whereas Lawrence's grass, it can have it, you know, as long as it gets water, it is the same value to it. So yeah, so that's the sort of technology that we're utilising. So we're using sensors to tell us what's going on, that is then controlling the irrigation, put it in. So we monitor that obviously and adjust it based on the patterns and the growth of the plant and whether we're going to be harvesting the fruit tomorrow or not, because you don't want soft fruit when you're harvesting it. Those type of things, but it's largely now automated. So it's exactly the same technology that they use in glass houses. We've actually taken out and using on large scale outdoor production.
Yeah. So I think I mean that's really interesting, Gavin. Actually, I like that analogy of the intravenous drip. I mean, Toby, I know you've been working with PepsiCo, and maybe you could elaborate on some of the innovative approaches that have been particularly effective in improving water management practices. So maybe you could just sort of take us through a few minutes of that.
Well, PepsiCo have been working to reduce water usage within the potato and corn supply chains in water-stressed regions. So as part of that, we've helped them to measure water use through a modelling approach based on the types of irrigation systems they're using. And a key part of this work is basically understanding how much water is being used in those areas where there is inefficiencies in the system in terms of the irrigation practices, and then looking at what are the opportunities to improve those. What we've been doing is helping them to measure water use, looking at these different practices, understanding not only the water use and the efficiency of these practices, but also how they fit into the context of those agricultural systems. So, for example, you know, topography might influence what irrigation equipment is feasible within a particular area. There's also balancing between the costs of different irrigation equipment and the energy requirements for applying that water. So it's balancing all of these different things to identify ways in which water can be applied efficiently to the crop. But it's not just about understanding how to reduce water, it's about how to use water more effectively. So in some areas, they are thinking about, can we encourage the uptake of irrigation where it's not currently used, because actually we can boost yields through the use of effective irrigation. And that's going to be potentially more important as climate change has greater impacts on weather conditions and creating these sort of variable patterns that lead to situations where there is insufficient water. So we've basically been balancing the water needs of the crops against the types of irrigation equipment that's effective for those different locations.
Which is a little bit like what Gavin was talking about there, to be honest. And maybe we could finish up with Gavin and Lawrence, your knowledge of water today, you know, and the importance of water today and the journey you've gone on with water today. Is that a lot more evolved than it was maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago? You mentioned 3 generations of farmers, and I guess you've always appreciated the importance of water, but is that even more so now? Is that because of climate change?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, Lawrence. Certainly in our case, it's significantly more now. And in the past, you would put a bit extra on just to make sure it had enough. Whereas now, as I said, we're monitoring it 24/7 and giving it what it needs when it needs it. And we've seen like a halving of the amount of water per kilo of strawberries, for instance, even in the last less than 10 years. So in our case, in the fruit sector, very much so. Also the quality in the past, when I was younger, water was water and didn't really take too much notice of it as long as it came at the end of the irrigation line. Whereas I guess becoming more aware of these type of things and the impact it can have on plants, particularly berries, which are quite sensitive, particularly to sodium and fluoride, which are 2 elements in recycling of water. And hence why our involvement in it was to ensure that the water met a quality standard from a health perspective, as in don't want E. coli in it, but also they use the minimum amount of chlorine rather than give it an extra dose just to make sure, because the sodium and the fluoride are both toxic to our plants. So it's about getting that balance. And I think farming in general, particularly in the fruit and vegetable sector, has come a long way in regards to not only appreciating water because of the scarcity of it, but also how to utilise it better at the right times of the day. That type of thing, as Toby was mentioning.
I like the idea of if you needed a bit more, you just throw a bit more water on it just in case. I think I quite like that. I think those days are gone, actually, Gavin, to be honest. So Lawrence, do you want to just finish up? Have you any thoughts around that?
Yeah, probably for us, like water's been the lifeblood of our business and the lifeblood of my family for as long as I can remember. I can remember Dad having sleepless nights as a child because it didn't rain. I've had my own sleepless nights because it didn't rain. Currently, we're not doing as much work as we should be because it's raining, but I made a pact a long time ago never to complain about the rain. So water has been the lifeblood of our family for as long as I can remember. So we've definitely come through a long journey of education throughout participating in the scheme. My knowledge of water and water quality has definitely increased, but to be honest, my knowledge of construction and those processes have increased exponentially throughout interaction with our JV partners. So I know today is a bit more talking about water, but if you ask me what I've learned the most along this 5-year joint venture journey, it's definitely been about construction, about efficiency, about engaging with as many people as possible to get the best outcome as possible. So thanks so much to Mike and his team for bringing us along on that journey. It's been a once-in-a-lifetime project for us as a business, and it's a once-in-a-lifetime project for the region. There are 4 other growers that will be receiving water once it's started, and I know that they're all very, very excited, just as we are, for the for the tap to be turned on and them to transform their businesses.
Well, I think that's a fantastic note to finish on, Lawrence. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, the thought of sort of, you know, losing sleep because it's not raining when you live where I live is sort of something that never really occurred to me, to be honest. But I can see what you mean, and I think, Gavin, you should get some of those islanders playing rugby, not soccer. I think they'd probably be of more use to the Wallabies, I think, if you did that. So on that note, can I thank everybody, Gavin and Lawrence and Toby and Sarah, and of course Mike as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.